sum up this week and what happened at home and abroad, and some of the things that happened in between that are just staggering at this point. So there are some disagreements between the Trump administration and North Korea's Kim regime for why the Hanoi summit ended in failure.
Basically, they wanted the sanctions lifted in their entirety, and we couldn't do that. They were willing to denuke a large portion of the areas that we wanted, but we couldn't give up all of the sanctions for that. But it was about sanctions. I mean, they wanted sanctions lifted, but they weren't willing to do an area that we wanted. They were willing to give us areas, but not the ones we wanted.
However, while President Trump was aboard Air Force One heading home at around midnight local time, North Korean officials called a rare news conference where they offered their own view of what went wrong. According to North Korea's foreign minister, they proposed the, quote, partial removal of sanctions, not in full, in exchange for the permanent and complete dismantlement of the Yongbyon nuclear facility and a, quote, permanent halt of the nuclear testing and long-range rocket launch tests. Their foreign minister adds that, quote, the U.S. insisted that we should take one more step and was not ready to accept our proposal, adding, quote, it is difficult to say whether there might be a better agreement than this one, and, quote, our proposal will never be changed, even though the U.S. proposes negotiations again in the future. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says that President Trump, quote, is aware of North Korea's disagreements and would not comment further. So there was that discrepancy. But stateside, the big issue was one of the more controversial statements that President Trump made during his post-summit news conference regarding the death of American college student Otto Warmbier, who died days after returning to the U.S. in a near vegetative state after being imprisoned by North Korea. Yesterday's news conference occurred on the third anniversary of Warmbier's public plea while in North Korean custody.
I entirely beg you, people and government of the DPR Korea, for your forgiveness. Please, I have made the worst mistake of my life, but please, act to save me. Please, think of my family.
I did speak about it, and I don't believe that he would have allowed that to happen. It just wasn't to his advantage to allow that to happen. Those prisons are rough. They're rough places, and bad things happened. But I really don't believe that he was, I don't believe he knew about it. He knew the case very well, but he knew it later. But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word.
It's an example of the ruthless nature of this regime. We shouldn't be naive about this regime and about the way they mistreat their own people, and certainly the way they mistreated Otto Warmbier. The mistreatment of Otto Warmbier was something that is unforgivable.
Otto Warmbier they made a spectacle out of him to the world, accusing him of being a traitor, a spy, and they executed him. The blood of Otto Warmbier is on the hands of Kim Jong-un. There's no doubt in my mind that he knew about it, he allowed it to happen, and the responsibility lies directly with Kim Jong-un.
You know, Mika, it is, again, that poor boy begging for his life and being brutalized and beaten and killed by Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un was a murderer. Nothing happens in that country that he doesn't order, he is a tyrant of the first order. And there is no way anybody would lay a hand on an American in North Korea unless Kim Jong-un wasn't delivering the direct orders. And Kim Jong-un had him beaten to death, put in a vegetative state to come home and die in front of his parents. And this week, Donald Trump once again embraced tyranny, and once again, basically, it's always, every day is Donald Trump's own personal Munich. I mean, he appeased yet another dictator, this time for the brutalizing death of an American college boy.
He cozied up to North Korea's dictator while his son-in-law cozied up to Saudi Arabia. And MBS. America's former ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, also weighed in, tweeting, quote, "Americans know the cruelty that was placed on Otto Warmbier by the North Korean regime. Our hearts are with the family."
Hold on. North Korean regime, also known as Kim Jong-un.
Exactly.
And she says, "Our hearts are with the Warmbier family for their strength and courage. We will never forget Otto. We can never forget Otto."
Because
even
the president
though
is
Donald
quick
Trump
to forget.
has.
Trump's defense of Kim Jong-un is hardly the first time he's put his faith in tyrants.
And some really bad things happened to Otto. Some really, really bad things.
Why are you?
But he tells me that he didn't know about it, and I will take him at his word. So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. I spoke with the king. I spoke with the Crown Prince yesterday, and he strongly said that he had nothing to do with this. This was at a lower level.
Just this week, Jared Kushner sat down with MBS in their first known meeting since the Saudi government's murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The New York Times reported last year about how the Saudis wooed Kushner through private and formal conversations with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. 3 former senior U.S. officials said that given Kushner's political inexperience, like zero, their private exchanges could make him susceptible to Saudi manipulation. And back in 2017, the Washington Post reported that Jared Kushner and Russia's ambassador to Washington discussed the possibility of setting up a secret and secure communications channel between Trump's transition team and the Kremlin. According to the Post, the idea was to use Russian diplomatic facilities to shield their discussions from monitoring. Also that year, the New York Times reported that Jared Kushner's relatives were working feverishly overseas, including in China, to solicit money for projects in the United States by highlighting their ties to Kushner.
All right, well, you know, so anyway, okay, enough of that. We know about Kushner and what he's done. He got his money, of course, from Qatar. So they ended up getting what they wanted. He was just shopping around, and like his father-in-law, just shopping around for money after they're out of the White House. And Katty K, it seems that again, Donald Trump hasn't met a tyrant he doesn't love, he doesn't respect, he doesn't believe over American intel officials. I mean, again, we showed the clips, Vladimir Putin, where he believes this ex-KGB guy over the intel community. Of course, we know. Same thing with North Korea. I mean, it just, you know, stupid me. Grew up a Republican and a conservative, and I found this Ronald Reagan quote. To this day, this morning, to this day, America is still the abiding alternative to tyranny. This is our purpose in the world, nothing more and nothing less. For Reagan, for conservatives during the Cold War, certainly for us Republicans, while I was growing up, our organizing principle was small government and standing up to tyrannical regimes across the globe. Donald Trump has completely turned that on its head.
Yeah, and supporting democracy and supporting human rights. This is a very far cry from even President Bush's second inaugural address, where he promised to help the downtrodden around the world. And there was no question of North Korea's human rights horrific acts during that Vietnam summit, and it was kind of symbolized by the Otto Warmbier comments that the president made. And the red flag there must be, look, if the president is prepared to take Kim Jong-un at his word on this, when there is so much evidence from his own intel community that Kim Jong-un must have known about it, must have ordered it. We just saw the clip of Otto Warmbier before he died standing up in a fake courtroom. How could Kim Jong-un not know about that? It's not possible that he didn't know about it. If he's prepared, the president, to give Kim Jong-un the benefit of the doubt on something like that, what else is he prepared to give these people the benefit of the doubt on?
Exactly.
What else is he prepared to give away of America's interests in this quest of what he calls his fantastic relationship diplomacy? You speak to people at the White House. I've spoken to Jared Kushner about this. They believe in this notion that President Trump can change the facts of the world just by his personality, just by who he is, just by these relationships he has with people. And I think what happened in Hanoi, particularly symbolized by those Otto Warmbier comments, is an awareness that that just doesn't work. There are real limits to relationship diplomacy. Donald Trump is not able, just because of who he is, to fix the intractable problems of the world.
Well, and Susan Del Percio, you too, another Republican, certainly in the past, I don't know about now, but we grew up believing that the United States, as Reagan said, was a city shining brightly on the hill for all the world to see, that we were the example to the world when it came to freedom, that our organizing principle was freedom, that we stood up against tyrants, that we learned our lesson at Munich. And yet, if you're an American whose loved one is beaten to death in North Korea, you can know this president will not stand up to a tyrant. If you know someone who was assassinated in Russia, a political opponent, or somebody that crossed Vladimir Putin's path, you know Donald Trump will take the word of Vladimir Putin over his own intel community. And of course, the Saudis, I mean, a journalist, a Washington Post journalist, is killed, carved up with a bone saw while he is still alive. Donald Trump says he believes the murderer, and then his son-in-law goes over there to continue their dear, close relationship. This is not the Republican Party of our youth. It's not the America that we grew up in, where you have a president, a commander-in-chief that embraces tyrants and has utter contempt for our NATO allies and people who were elected democratically.
That's right, Joe. And the president is, one thing he does is he acts out of his own self-interest. He did not go to Hanoi representing the United States of America. He went there representing himself. He thinks that he can do these deals one-on-one. And the one thing that has just been nagging at me since we heard his comments about Otto Warmbier is, did he ever think for a moment about his parents? He took his parents and showed them around, and he used it to his own self-interest. And he was out there basically telling to Otto's parents, saying, "You're suffering." It wasn't at the hands of North Korea's leader. We put faith in. I trust him. I just can't imagine how they must feel this morning and yesterday hearing those comments, because this is a president with no humanity, with no empathy, and no decency. That's how he implements this policies. That's how he can go and send Jared on his mission to Saudi Arabia. That's how he can continue to look people in the eye and say he's out there trying to help make America great again. He is not trying to do anything what the sort. He is trying to make himself matter and relevant, and he does it and makes this country suffer, unfortunately, not just for the days to come or the weeks to come, but for the years to come.
Well, and again, they're oldies but goldies, Mika, but really quickly, two more for Republicans who actually no longer support freedom and actually support a president who embraces tyrants. The United States remains the last best hope for a mankind plagued by tyranny and deprivation. The March of Freedom and Democracy will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. That's Kim Jong-un, that's Vladimir Putin, that's MBS, that's everybody that Donald Trump embraces, everybody that he embraces worldwide.
You have to wonder why. I think we can make a simple assumption that people in the White House are trying their best, and that they're telling him these things. They're informing him. They're educating him. And yet he still does it. You have to wonder why.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.